Bill, welcome to breakfast.
Good morning. Nice to be here.
Bill Emmott, you believe that Asia is entering a new period of balance of power politics, something like we might have seen in 19th century Europe. The first time in history we've seen three powerful countries in the Asia region: Japan, India and China. What is of concern? Is there anything of concern about that?
Well, I think that basically it's good news that you've got three countries balancing each other, because if the real concern would be if one was dominant, because that would be particularly a concern for the rest of the world, but also for the small countries of Asia. If China was absolutely dominant in Asia, then I think everyone would be cowering around the Chinese emperor, if you like. The fact that India is getting strong and that Japan's still there is a balance for China. However, of course, the three are suspicious of each other, and you could well get a military build-up, and then possible tensions over particularly border disputes which still exist, history, and other tensions, other sources of tension between the great powers.
Well, let's talk about those in a second, but just looking at this power balance, is it really a balance though? I mean, China's emerging pretty quickly. It's growing very quickly. It's investing a lot in its military. It's beefing up its navy. It's also now, I think, talking about aircraft carriers even. It's clearly got big plans and perhaps the means, much more of the means than India, say.
Well, when I say balance, I don't mean that they're equal. I think that in 19th century Europe, Britain was the most powerful country in Europe, but the point was that it wasn't strong enough actually to dominate or take over Europe. Other countries, particularly Prussia, France, were strong enough to make it think twice before doing anything. It's like that in Asia. China will be the strongest country in Asia, but the others are strong enough to make it think twice before feeling that it can bully people, move into other countries, dominate sea lanes and all that kind of thing. It cannot operate alone, and therefore this provides a kind of nice counterweight to China.
Importantly, there's been already set perceptions. India, I think, has felt that it should be the leading power in the region. Suddenly it's got China emerging all over its territory. It's helping in Sri Lanka, which, it's working across sea lanes in the Indian Ocean. Is that just China developing because it can, because it's making trade relationships, further and further apart? It's also looking strategically further and further away. Or is that something more concerted on the part of China, do you think, to be intervening, for instance, directly in India, what India might have thought was its territory?
Well, I think that China has always sought to destabilize India a little bit by supporting Pakistan. It provided the nuclear weapons blueprints for Pakistan in the 1970s and 80s, which now means that you've got two nuclear powers facing off against each other in South Asia. And similarly, it's helping Sri Lanka with the same spirit. But it's also acting naturally, the sort of thing that any major country like that would do as its interests get wider. It needs to import a lot of raw materials and oil across the Indian Ocean. It needs basing rights for its navy as its naval tasks get larger. It also wants to get routes across land through Burma, through Pakistan, through elsewhere to avoid getting blockaded in the Malacca Straits. So what it's doing is not unusual or particularly strange, but as elephants get bigger, they tend to start treading on the toes of other people.
And they need management. Does this go directly to an idea that our Prime Minister has put up there into the global debate? Kevin Rudd's idea of some kind of Asia-Pacific community, a new forum to help sort of manage these tensions, smooth these tensions and build trust within the region. Initially, a lot of Asian countries said it was not needed. What's your view?
I think that your Prime Minister is quite right about this. It is needed. You need a forum in which countries feel obliged to exchange information, to think of each other's interests. My question about his proposal is whether his idea of the community is too wide. He wants to bring in the United States into these meetings.
You wouldn't do that?
I wouldn't do that. I would have a European Union type arrangement in which it was Asian countries, including Australia, who were making the main headway, particularly in economic affairs. And then for defense and security, you can have a NATO-type arrangement separate from that, in which obviously the United States would have to be there. But I think that mainly you want Asians talking to Asians.
And we're going to hit the news in a minute or so, I'm sorry, but I noticed that you've written recently that a perilous regional arms race looms. Now, that's pretty frightening as we look at what's happening in the Korean Peninsula right now. Do you see that really as looming or just there?
I think it's inevitable that there'll be an arms race, particularly between the navies of the region. China's increasing its spending 15 to 20% a year. India, as long as it can afford to, is going to be doing the same to catch up, building aircraft carriers and so on. It's a sort of insurance policy against each other.
And just very briefly, we've spoken about China and India, not so much about Japan's role here. It's been economically challenged for a while now, but it remains a power, nevertheless.
Yeah, it feels it's in a defensive mode. It's got its alliance with the United States. That helps it, but it's mainly worried that China is going to encroach on its rights. So it's trying to help India. Basically, Japan's tactic is to strengthen India to counter China.
It's a changing world, and the global financial crisis has meant it's changing even quicker than we thought, I think. Bill Emmott, thank you so much for joining us.
It was a pleasure.
Bill Emmott is the former editor of The Economist magazine and the author most recently of a book called Rivals, How the Power Struggle Between China, India and Japan Will Shape Our Next Decade. That's published by Penguin Books.